To the town of our free who rode a stranger one fine day. Hardly spoke to folks around him, didn't have too much to say. No one dared to ask his business, no one dared to make a slip. The stranger there among them had a big iron on his hip, big iron on his hip.
Hi, my name is Jason Parker, and I'd like to take a little time to talk to you about a leader that was important in my life. I know you don't know who this man was, for he wasn't a political, religious, or military leader, and he wasn't the ruler of a vast kingdom, but this man was a king in his own rights. They say true wealth comes from having love and respect of your peers and your family. If that's the case, this was one of the wealthiest men to ever walk the face of the earth. He was larger than life. He commanded respect with his sheer personality, and he was usually the center of attention in any room he entered. He always had a story to tell, and most people wanted to listen to it. This was my grandfather. His name was Marvin Elroy Freestone, and he was born January 14th, 1921 in Glen, Florida, Wisconsin. He was born to Claude and Ellen Freestone, who had two other kids, Dawn and Virgie. Now, Grandpa grew up in the Great Depression, so money and food were hard to come by. So his father, Claude, taught him how to hunt, and when they would lead hunting parties for food for the family and to teach other families to take care of theirs. Marvin later on would lead his own hunting parties, and he would sell pelts for extra money for the family. Marvin loved being outdoors, he loved nature, and he loved helping his family. Marvin was an athlete. He loved to play basketball. He was usually the captain of his team. He used to tell me a story that him and his brother couldn't play basketball on the same court at the same time, because the family could only afford one pair of basketball shoes, and they had to share them. Grandpa played baseball. He was always a pitcher. As a matter of fact, he played baseball until he was 72 years old. When he was in high school, he got sick with a bacterial infection, and he was sick for quite some time. This kept him from graduating, and I know this bothered him really bad because he went back to school in 1963 to get his high school diploma in Tacoma, Washington. This same sickness kept him from being in the military, which again bothered him. But it didn't deter him from doing his duty to his community or his country. For he ended up being a civil servant for the Department of the Army. He ended up being a police officer for the Tacoma Police Department. And he started working at Keyport in 1966 until he retired in about 1986. In 1945, he met his queen, my grandma, Wilma McDivitt, and together they had 3 kids, David, Melva, and my mom, Mindy. Marvin used to be the leader of David's Explorer Scout troop, and they would often go camping in the woods, and he would teach them how to survive. Grandpa loved teaching people this kind of stuff. Even one time they got an accommodation from the National Explorer Scout Committee for bringing home more food than they left with. In 1971, Grandpa's father died, and he took it upon himself to help his mom. At least once a month, he would go to her place, and he would help do chores and errands, or just to have lunch with her. A little later on, Grandma was only 4'10" or something, so she was having a hard time getting in and out of his truck. So he actually put steps on his beloved Chevy truck just so she could get in and out. That's the kind of person he was. He was always putting other people ahead of himself and always doing what he could to help. Now that I've given you a little backstory on Marvin, I'd like to tell you why I chose him as my leadership story and why he was important to me. Growing up, my father had alcoholism. This made our life very hard. He had a hard time holding down a job, so he moved us around a lot, sometimes multiple times a year. And my dad really didn't have any problem living in motorhomes or campers. Even one time I remember living in a tent. We had houses on and off, but Dad had a hard time keeping a place and food for us. But Marvin and my grandma would always give us a place if we had to go back and things were too rough with Dad. That happened a lot growing up. We went back and forth, living with Grandma, Grandpa living with my dad. The only time we had any real structure in life was living with my grandparents. The only time we could start to do good in school was living with my grandparents. My dad only could thought of a couple of things, and things like sports and music, and our academic progress wasn't high on his priority list. I remember once living in Utah with my dad. I was probably 3 years old. Things got pretty rough and my mom called my grandparents for help. Without a second thought, they drove from Washington to Utah, picked us up, and took us back. I remember another time, I was probably 14, my dad went out drinking with his boss, and he got fired. And that wasn't the first time he'd been fired, and it wasn't the first time he was fired from this exact same job. But it was the last time this was going to happen. My mom called my grandparents, and the very next morning I hear a knock at the door, and I go and open up the door, and there's my grandparents there. And they want to talk to my mom and dad. And they sit him down. My grandpa didn't judge him or belittle him or talk down to him. Instead, he handed him a check, and a blank check, and told him just to go buy what he needed to start his own business. My grandpa could see potential in him, even if my dad couldn't see the potential in himself. That business is what got us by until I moved out, and even after, until his life caught up with him. I still have some of those tools. Marvin also bought me my first set of tools when I started out in my career. Without that, I don't think I'd have been able to do it. Being an auto mechanic is awful expensive. I also bought my first house from my grandparents. As I'm sitting in my childhood room right now doing this video. I remember my grandpa gave me and my wife a place to live when we first got together. And after my son was born, we stayed there for a little while, and we finally got our own house. But my son always stayed with my grandparents when me and my wife would go to work and I'd go to school. They always took care of Mitchell, and I'm glad that he got to spend some time with them, especially after Grandpa was fully retired and he got to spend some real quality time with that man. My grandpa didn't judge people. He took them for who they were and looked for the potential in them. He didn't talk down to people. He didn't disrespect people. That's the kind of person he was. And he never talked about the sacrifices he had to make to help our family or help my dad. He just did it. And that's what true leaders do. They put other people ahead of themselves, and they sacrifice. In about 1997, my grandpa started getting sick with Alzheimer's disease. This was hard on the family because this once independent, strong leader of the family started to need help, show weakness, which he never did growing up. In 2007, he passed away from this. And my grandma was fighting cancer at the time, and she passed away in October of the same year. We used to do Christmases and birthdays and Thanksgivings at my grandparents' house, and they used to host family reunions for their anniversaries, a 50th and a 60th and things like that. But after Grandma and Grandpa passed away, the family stopped doing this kind of stuff. Me and my mom and my family get together for Christmases and Thanksgiving, but it's not like it was in the old days where all the cousins were there and the aunts and uncles. And that's the kind of leader my grandpa was. He kept the family together. He was always like an anchor for everybody. So, Grandpa, I miss you. And rest in peace. And I'll see you on the other side.
To the town of our free who rode a stranger one fine day. Hardly spoke to folks around him, didn't have too much to say. No one dared to ask his business, no one dared to make a slip. The stranger there among them had a big iron on his hip, big iron on his hip.